Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's CEDA live stream event, Net Zero Jobs, Opportunities in a Climate Positive Future. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Melinda Salento. I'm the Chief Executive of the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, and I'm really pleased to be here today for what I think is going to be a super engaging and interesting conversation with some great panellists. Let me start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which I'm sitting on. I'm here in Melbourne on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And of course, our speakers are scattered across the country, but here from Wurundjeri land, I wanted to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also just pay my thanks and respects to the Wurundjeri people for the way in which they share tradition, culture and learnings with non-Indigenous Australians in the spirit of reconciliation. Now, on to today's topic, climate change, literally the topic of the day, isn't it? As we look across the country and see the extreme weather events that we're experiencing, there's obviously a lot of momentum now behind the conversation on climate change, gathering momentum around action on the part of business, but also an increasing focus on government policy and government commitments and targets, if I can put it that way. For us here at CEDA, this is a critically important topic and conversation. Our purpose, of course, is to positively shape social and economic development in Australia for the greater good. And there's no doubt that climate change is critically important to our economic and social future and, of course, our environmental future. All of these issues right at the core of what we do at CEDA. In our engagement on this issue, we're really keen to be promoting challenging but constructive conversations with a bit more of a can-do focus, if I can put it that way, around how we can respond both in terms of action and resilience, but also as we increasingly look to reducing emissions and decarbonisation. So we're wanting to play a constructive and consistent role in that conversation and bringing the conversations to you as members of CEDA and a broader audience so that you can reflect on the actions that you can take and where you would like to see policy heading. So that's basically, I guess, our remit, if you like, in terms of the role that we're trying to play through live streams like this, but we're also doing a range of other things, including holding Chatham House roundtables. We had one yesterday, and these are sort of frank and fearless conversations, if I can put it that way. In a shameless plug for CEDA, if these issues are important to you and you're a CEDA trustee, you can come along. If you're not a member, perhaps there's another reason why you might like to join. Anyway, enough of the CEDA promotion. Let me run through today's event just very quickly. We are going to hear first from Professor Ross Garner. He's going to speak for around about 10 minutes. Then he will hand over to Casper Torhog. Sorry, Casper, I hope I said that right, who's the CEO from Star of the South. And then finally, we'll hear from Pradeep Phillip from Deloitte Access Economics. And then it's over to you. As always in these events, we love to get questions from our audience. You can do that using the Pigeonhole app that we've got accessible. If you haven't got the link open, you can go to ceda.pigeonhole.at and the password is net zero. So that's a rough run of today's events. We'll finish at 1:30. If you're watching the event and you want to get on social media, please do so. If you're on Twitter, tag us at CEDA_news and tag me at Melinda Salento. That's enough from me. Let me now hand over to Professor Ross Garner, who then is going to hand over to Casper when he's finished speaking. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ross.
Thanks, Melinda. Well, a month ago, I brought out a new book, Reset, Restoring Australia After the Pandemic Recession. And in that book, I talk about how it's not desirable, but also not possible for us simply to go back to where we were in the 7 years before the pandemic recession. What we've gone through in the last year is unusual in economic history. In the first half of last year, Australia, the developed world, and the world as a whole had the sharpest reduction in output in GDP that we've ever had over a 6-month period. For the year as a whole, it wasn't so rough in the second half of the year. There were substantial increases in output in the world as a whole. So big in China that China was the one country in the world that for the year as a whole didn't have a decline in GDP, but it was nevertheless the slowest growth in a year that China's had in the reform era, which began in 1978. So it was a big phenomenon. It had an immediate huge impact on international trade, much sharper decline in the volume of international trade in the first half of last year than we've ever seen, as much of a decline in a couple of months, so when the restrictions started to go on in March and April, as we had in the first 14 months of the Great Depression, as we had in the first year of the GFC. But then it stabilized, and it stabilized for the same reason that the total global output stabilized, massive and quick fiscal and monetary expansion. Different mix of fiscal and monetary expansion than after the GFC. First of all, the expansion was much bigger and quicker than after the GFC. There was more fiscal in the mix, more increasing government expenditure in particular. That's partly because interest rates globally were already near zero in many developed countries, so that there wasn't such room for monetary expansion as there had been after the GFC. But massive fiscal expansion, massive monetary expansion, more fiscal than monetary. Australia was, in the first few months, was just about the biggest fiscal expansion. We had more of a focus on fiscal rather than monetary than the rest of the world, and fiscal expansion happens quickly, so that we got a very early response. And so in most of the world, you had recovery in the second half of last year, but not enough to outweigh the decline in the first half of the year. Big questions about what happens next. Some countries by the end of the year were well on top of the disease. These were all in the Western Pacific region, with the exception of Ethiopia in Africa, but all of the other big success stories were in our region. Probably top of the global league table were Taiwan and New Zealand. Japan, Korea did very well. China did very well after the initial lapses that allowed the escape of the disease from Wuhan. And on China's borders, Thailand, Vietnam did very well. The developed countries in the rest of the world did not do well, and early this year, Europe, and including the UK and North America, still had catastrophic levels of infection and disease. Economic recovery was strongest in the places where the disease was under control, and that was in our region. First, I've already mentioned China, but also Australia, and in a number of the Western Pacific countries where the disease was under control. Big story now, of course, is the spread of the vaccine, going very quickly in some countries. Still uncertainty about how effective it will be against some of the new strains, but the odds are that that will bring things under control in a lot of developed countries by around the middle of this year. Some developed countries, including Australia, a bit later. Most of the developing world are still in deep trouble, with, of course, the exception of China. But most of the developing world in deep trouble. And for us, and here I'm in Queensland at the moment, with an immediate impact on Queensland, one of the late catastrophes is Papua New Guinea, where rates of infection are extremely high. We don't actually know much about it in the country as a whole because there's no public health system to test the extent of the disease, but partial evidence suggests that it's now catastrophic. What we know from the experience of the last year, you don't solve the economic problem, you don't get back to growth without solving the pandemic problem. Early in the response to the health crisis, our Prime Minister and Treasurer were saying we wanted to snap back to what we had before the pandemic. And in my book, I've got a chapter, Wrong Way, Don't Go Back, about how that's neither appropriate nor possible. It's not possible because a number of things will be worse than they were then. We will have had a couple of years of the biggest fiscal deficits in Australian peacetime history, by far. This year, twice as big as a share of GDP than any deficit before in the Commonwealth level, and second biggest was last year as a share of GDP. Nothing like it in peacetime history. And managing that legacy means that things are not the same now as they were 2013 to 2019. Productivity growth was miserable during 2013 to 2017, and one could expect it to be worse now. Productivity growth comes from capital expenditure, expansion of the capital stock per person, and from growth in total factor productivity. These were both very low late in the 7 years before the pandemic, and there's reason to think both will be lower for the next few years than in those years. So just go back to the old policies, and it's even harder than those times. And I spent a bit of time in that chapter showing how unsatisfactory our economic performance was in those years. I call them the dog days from 2013 to 2019. Output per person, the slowest growing in the developed world, lower than Japan. We're used to thinking of Japan being a bit of an underperformer, but we were lower than Japan in 2013, 2019. Almost no growth at all in real household income per capita over 7 years. That's a very unusual duration of stagnation of per capita household income. Unemployment stuck at around 5.5%, 5 point something. Unlike other developing countries, over the dog days, over those 7 years, the US went from having unemployment a few percentage points higher than Australia down to 3.5%. We were just stuck for 7 years at 5.5%. Not only stuck, but not really knowing how miserable that performance was. We sort of got to accept that was normal. The other developed countries didn't, the US didn't. And underemployment rose and rose. Of course, you're not unemployed in the stats data if you worked an hour in the week before that you were surveyed. And the surveys also show that a rapidly increasing proportion of Australians through the dog days were saying they would like more hours of work than they had. They were employed, but for less hours than they wanted to. So for all those reasons, we don't want to go back, and for other reasons, we can't go back. So what do we do now as we go forward? I put a lot of emphasis in the book on the need to avoid getting back to high employment and then full employment simply from demand expansion, from increasing government expenditure. That's what we've done so far, and that was appropriate. That huge fiscal expansion stopped things being very much worse. And credit to the government for that, credit to the Treasurer and the Treasury for that. There are people now who say, oh, well, the fact that we're making a strong recovery, that things are almost back to pre-pandemic levels of total output, mean that the challenge was never as bad as it was. Well, it was as bad as it was, and that huge fiscal expansion is why things were not very much worse. So, but while that was appropriate as an initial response, it's not appropriate as a continuing response. We do need continued strong stimulus. We can't let demand fall away, but the stimulus now has to come from measures that will increase long-term productivity. That will need a big increase in investment and output in the trade-exposed industries, especially the export industries. we won't have a basis for restoration of incomes growth unless that's a big part of the mix. We can't do it from domestic demand expansion alone. And there's some quite big constraints on export growth. 22% of our exports are fossil energy, coal and gas, and they won't be growing. Coal will be declining because of what other countries are doing on the climate and energy transition. So that's a headwind. Another headwind is the most dynamic part of our exports in the dog days were tradable services led by education, which became our third biggest export industry. Well, they've been hit first by what COVID did to international travel, and then hit again because the business models of the universities have been crippled by the pandemic and the absence of emergency support. Other service industries that were hit by the ban on international travel, like casinos, received huge inputs from JobKeeper. The universities were excluded. Those high priority industries like casinos will bounce back reasonably well, but the universities financially have been crippled. So you won't get the growth in, we will lose our international standing. We were punching way above our weight in the global rankings for the quality of universities before the pandemic. We had 6 universities in the top 100. China had 2. After the pandemic, or after these things have worked their way through, China will probably have more top-ranking universities, and we will. We'll lose our attraction. So that's a big headwind, a very serious one, with domestic productivity implications as well as export implications. And third headwind, of course, all the trade issues with China. So we'd be pessimistic about growth prospects just looking at that. But what makes it different and what gives us actually a very good opportunity is what's happened to the global climate and energy story. Over the past year, we've seen all of the developed countries except Australia commit to zero net emissions by 2050. The US joining and completing the story with the Biden election. China committing to zero net emissions by 2060. That adds up to a huge change. And it was a theme of my last book, Superpower, in the end of 2019, that in a zero emissions world economy, Australia just has huge economic advantages. We've got by far the richest combination of solar and wind resources in the developed world. Even stronger on a per capita basis, and that's what matters for economic comparative advantage. We're the natural place to process Australian minerals in a zero emissions world using zero emissions hydrogen and electricity. We're not the natural place in the high fossil energy world. We've got the richest metallurgical coal resources in the world, but it's cheaper to take Queensland or New South Wales coal to Kobe or Shanghai than to take it to Whyalla. But renewable energy and hydrogen are not internationally tradable in the same way. All of the advantages will be in using the Australian renewable energy and hydrogen for Australian industry. That's a huge dimension. We are the main exporter in the world of a lot of the products that use a lot of the minerals that use a lot of energy in processing. We supply about 40% of the world's high-grade iron ore, where China is half of the world's steel industry. We supply 60% of its iron ore. The economically rational place to turn that iron ore into metal in the zero emissions world economy is Australia. And our other huge advantage is our opportunity for growing biomass, sequestering carbon in our landscape. We've got far more woodland per head of population than any other developed country. The developed countries have got more than developing countries. Exports of carbon credits from soils and plants, growing biomass as a base for industry to replace petroleum and coal as a base for plastics chemical manufacturers becomes a huge advantage. Make good use of this opportunity and the expansion of opportunity turns out to be bigger than what we lose from those severe headwinds. Leave it there, Melinda, till we get to questions.
Thanks so much, Ross. Sorry, I'm putting myself on mute. Great introduction to the conversation and really nice place to finish off in terms of where the opportunity is for Australia. And what a great segue now to Casper, who can really take us on a bit of a journey, I think, on where that opportunity is and how very real it is for Australia. So over to you, Casper. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Melinda. Appreciate the chance of speaking here. It's extremely interesting to hear you speak, Ross, and the potential that is here for Australia. And representing Star to South, which is Australia's first post-offshore wind farm, we can concur that is one of the reasons why we are developing the project. Maybe just being aware that as we are the first project in Australia, maybe not everyone is fully aware what offshore wind is. But offshore wind is an industry that's been around for some time now. The first project was made in '92 in Denmark, but especially the UK has really developed this technology. And right now, offshore wind is foreseen to be a backbone of the EU's transition, including UK as well, transition into renewable energy. And maybe a fun story from my old earlier days, in the middle of last decade, I was sitting making a consultancy report to the EU Commission on various scenarios of how to adopt renewable technologies in. And we did make an extreme scenario with offshore turbines all the way over all of the North Sea. Most people were laughing at that scenario. But I can tell you 10 years later, I was standing at an installation vessel installing my own project in the North Sea. And I looked all the way around and there was offshore turbines everywhere. And I did take a picture of that and sent to my former employer, say it's happening now. And I think that is what we will see is a drastic and a more rapid transition that most people predict. And it's also through our discussion with AEMO, that is how we understand they see the world as well. Then it is offshore wind becoming an industry that's going global, especially US and the Asia Pacific area. US now with Biden administration coming in, now front loading offshore wind and really pushing for that to be built within the next 4 years. But Asia Pacific is actually foreseen to be the key driver for offshore wind over the next year. Currently 30 gigawatts of offshore wind is installed, but they expect that to increase to 230 in 10 years. Which is a massive growth. And we have seen in the industry no impact by the pandemic. Not so at all, growth rates remain strong. And also when we raise capital for renewable energy projects, that is clearly where people want to invest money. It is into this transition to renewable technologies and generation, because it's seen as the safe future for people to invest money into. And then maybe the question is why go for offshore wind and why should it be part of Australia's mix? One thing is it's a possibility of doing large-scale generation, which is sometimes a limiting factor onshore. But there are very few constraints offshore to get really bulk load of generation into the net. Secondly, it provides mixed generation. So when you make your power generation, you need various profiles, different weather profiles. The sun is not shining at the same place, and the wind is blowing at different times in different parts of the country. So you make a mix of technologies to kind of balance out and have a stable grid. And then, of course, local employment is one of the key reasons why US and also UK went into this industry. It is a key driver of employment in regional areas where the society generates benefits greatly from these parts of regions to also see a significant growth. And many examples can be mentioned from UK, including Hull and Grimsby and smaller fishing towns that now have turned into big growth cities in these regions. And lastly, considering the technology you need in Australia is important. It's not only electricity that needs to be replaced. It is actually all the other generation, the energy consumption. And right now, Australia is currently at 21% of renewable technology in the power generation. But if you look at the energy consumption as a total for the country, it's only around 6%. So there is a huge challenge in the state's ambition of getting zero emission. And in that part, you need large-scale generation to be able to produce hydrogen and other sources as ammonia or methanol to power the industries. Then maybe the story of start us out, just to introduce this. So it's the first proposed project in Australia, and we are based in Victoria, and we are planning to build the project in Bass Strait. And as most people will know from that part of the region, it is a pretty windy place, which is why we are there. We actually seek those kind of things, and that is the strong rationale for offshore wind. The wind is stronger, it's more persistent. There's less influence on the wind going to the turbines, which is really, really good. Then we are just off Latrobe Valley, so we will connect into the power hub of Victoria. The whole history of power generation is based in Latrobe Valley, and we will reuse that existing infrastructure that is already there. And that will also enable us to provide a new potential for jobs in a declining region, especially Latrobe Valley and Gippsland is facing challenges as we go ahead. Lately with the announcement of the Yallourn coal power plant closing in mid-28. And that history we hope to be part of transitioning people into renewable jobs in the offshore wind sector. And furthermore, the progress we have seen in both federal level and state level are very promising. So the federal level are now promoting an Offshore Clean Energy Act, which enables that project like ours can get the operational licenses that we need to construct and operate the wind farm. Also here, precisely in Victoria, last year they announced that they are launching the offshore wind sector strategy. So right now they're looking into how offshore wind should be deployed in the state, which we find quite as a sector indicates more than one project, which would be a strong build out of this new industry and create a lot of potential jobs, which again creates the potential of using all that power for fueling export or domestic industry that also needs to transition into renewable power. Then maybe from the project itself, just constructing the project will generate quite a lot of jobs. And more projects will generate more jobs. For us, we are modeling a project of 2.2 gigawatts. That is what we are trying to develop a project up to. And over such a project, if you look at direct jobs, directly from us, it's around 2,000 direct jobs in the OS lifetime, whereas 760 of those will be in Gippsland, so the local area, which is 200 of is long-term jobs directly hired by us as a company. Then there's a lot of different ways of looking at job numbers. So you can also look at indirect job numbers, and of course then it increases up to 8,000 indirect jobs instead of the 2,000. So this is our ambition of being part of this transition and creating new possibilities for regions that need new jobs. And we are very encouraged by the local community backing up so strongly for us.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Casper. Really great to get very tangible examples of what can be done and really touching on, I think, what some of the hot button issues are, if you like, around what this transition means, not just for the country as a whole, but for regions and jobs in particular places, which is so critical. I'm going to give you a question on notice, which I'm going to come back to. I think one of the things we're hearing a lot from business about is the certainty or uncertainty of policy, and you've touched on a few things which have obviously underpinned the investment decisions of Star of the South. But at some point, I'm hoping we'll get some questions. We'll come back and maybe explore that in a little bit more detail. But now I'm just going to hand over to Pradeep, who I know is going to concisely deliver some final insights. We've got the questions rolling in. So if you want to get a question to any of our speakers, can I suggest you start typing now, because otherwise you're going to miss the boat. Pradeep, thanks so much.
Thank you, Melinda, and wonderful to be with you and Ross and Caspar and all of our friends on this webinar. Friends, in the end, structural change. That is the starting point when we think about the economy. And we know that the winds of structural change have been blowing for some time, now a raging wind. So a triptych presents itself: technological change, climate change, and a growing sense and reality of inequality, which is breaking down trust in our societies. And the three are intertwined. Now, these forces presented pre-COVID, but have raged through COVID, through 2020, and are reaching their peak in the coming years. The debate on climate in Australia has been particularly weak and disappointing, save for some highlights, one of which was the great report by our fellow panellist Ross Garnaut. But that was a decade ago. What strikes us in the intervening decade is that the economic arguments have barely gained a Guernsey. In its place, a meandering discussion has been unproductive and generated much uncertainty for business and the community alike. Uncertainty from chopping and changing on action, uncertainty from not, and now uncertainty from actions which are not coordinated or consistent. The price we are paying is that the window for transition is narrowing quickly and the opportunities we should be setting ourselves up for are diminishing. The debate on climate in Australia has struggled to get good traction for one core reason. Front-ending the debate has been one of the costs of action. It has become the mainstay of inaction and of misaction. It has confused the debate and laid down the parameters for the conditions under which this topic has been debated. But underpinning this has been the assumption that the economy will continue to grow at trend forever and a day, unaffected by the physical impacts of climate change. In other words, the parameter we have set for the debate to date has been that the costs of inaction are zero or negligible, and the costs of action have thus necessarily been large. But if you read the science and you look at the evidence, then a rational debate would dictate that holding to this assumption of the costless impact of unmitigated climate change is plainly false. So we have sought to overturn this, to flip the debate on its head, to create a new baseline for the economy which incorporates the damages associated with climate change into the baseline of the economy, to create a new starting point for our discussion, which should be about the costs of action, the costs of inaction, and the benefits of acting. Second, we've sought to not have Australia sit on the sidelines and wait for the world to change. It has often been pointed out what a small part of the global emissions Australia is. But if the problem is a collective one, then a seat at the table best protects our interests. And by the way, despite being a small part of the global emissions, we are disproportionately negatively impacted if the world doesn't solve for climate. So another reason to be not just at the table, but indeed leading the debate. We have the most to lose and conversely the most to gain. And as for waiting for the dirty great polluters of the world to shift, well, they already are. China and Japan and South Korea, the United States, most of Europe, all have shifted, and they will shift more in the lead up to the Biden summits and COP26. And with all the talk of carbon border adjustment tax mechanisms and carbon clubs, our hands are and will be forced regardless. More than that, consumers and investors are shifting rapidly, and businesses are responding to this faster than government and faster than regulators. So not everyone is stuck. They see the risks and are sensing the opportunities, just as we heard from Caspar, and are thus beginning the task of strategic pivots and transformational projects. In Australia, at Deloitte Access Economics, we've done some modelling, and our modelling of climate damages and the opportunities leads us to be optimistic because the arguments are clear and the numbers stack up. Our modelling suggested that the cost of inaction would, by 2070, be a loss of GDP of around 6%. That's around 3.4 trillion in today's dollars and about 880,000 jobs lost. That's the baseline we're establishing. In contrast, taking action on climate change would result by 2070 in GDP growth of around 2.6% and 250,000 jobs a year. Action on climate change is consistent with growth and with jobs. So let me conclude. To tackle this debate, we need to get the economics right, bring the financial and the climate science together. We need to model a transition, not a cliff. And friends, there is no choice but change. Climate change is now not just a scenario, it is the new economic baseline. There is no free ride under any path, but there are less costly ones. This creates a new choice, making Australia's economic climate for growth. Yes, there will be costs, and there will be some losers, but we're all losers if we fail to act. Thanks, Melinda.
Thanks, Pradeep. Really great segue to some of the questions that are flowing in, and I think for those of us who were participating in CEDA's roundtable yesterday, I think the way to sort of sum that up is that for too long the conversation has been about climate response or jobs or growth, and increasingly what we're now seeing is that it's very much an and conversation, and it's and not just one or two ands, if I could put it that way. Now, the absolute number one question that's on everyone's mind, it would seem, is one that Alex Lawler posed, which is really about how can businesses progress and champion net zero themselves and with their clients, absent a national policy framework and a national commitment to net zero. And obviously the states are in a particular place, but underpinning my question on notice to Casper was that we're hearing a lot about uncertainty and policy uncertainty and a lack of framework. So perhaps I might start with you, Ross, because you've been involved in trying to really drive a conversation around a national framework for so long. Maybe we'll start with you and then open it up to insights from both Pradeep and Casper as well.
Yeah, so in my book, Superpower, a year or so ago, I was at pains to point out that while a coherent national policy would be enormously beneficial economically, there were things that we could do within the existing framework. And I set out a number of things there that could be done within the existing Parliament in the 3 years that began in 2019, even within existing policy. And I think we've been doing some of those things. The expansion of the role of the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation in funding innovation, or especially ARENA for innovation, extending their role to zero emissions industry using renewable energy and not just producing renewable energy. They're all good institutional developments and an essential part of a final story. We won't get enough innovation through market exchange alone. You don't in any economy. There's an economic case for supporting innovation because of the externalities involved. The innovator, the first mover, generates a lot of knowledge that benefits other firms, other players in the economy. So it's a well-established economic case for support for innovation. And the government has extended the role of ARENA to do that in industry as well as renewable energy. But we're doing it on a tiny scale. Biden's now advancing a proposal for a couple of $1 trillion in investment in infrastructure, most of it focused around the energy transition and the climate transition. Well, on a per capita basis, we'd have to be spending about $50 billion a year on that to do the equivalent of what the US is doing. China, Korea, Japan, the European Union, UK are making comparable efforts to what Biden wants to do in the US. And I think we put about another $1 billion into the ARENA funding for to be spread over the next decade. The Emissions Reduction Fund, which supports certain kinds of emissions reduction, hugely all right in principle, but hugely limited in what it can do by the fact that it gets its funding from the budget and it doesn't get much from the budget. We need market mechanisms where people who are doing the reduction in emissions are rewarded by the true market value of reducing carbon. So we can do a fair bit within the existing framework, mainly because our advantages are so large, but we'd go very much faster if we join the rest of the world in a firm commitment to zero emissions by 2050. All other developed countries now have that. All Australian states and territories have that. It would help the framework within which business have to make its decision if that was there as well. That would make it easier for us to negotiate access to international carbon markets and the really big incentives for big expansions of zero emissions industry are going to come through international trade, getting access to the the developed country markets and China, which are going to find it cheaper to reach their own zero emissions objectives through high levels of imports of zero emissions products from Australia.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ross. And I think, I've heard a lot of people speaking about how, the national symbol of committing to that net zero also actually just gives permission to others to be more ambitious, which I think in and of itself is worth kind of acknowledging. Pradeep, I'm just going to ask you if you've got anything to add from a policy perspective, and then I'm going to flip it around and talk to Casper about the sorts of things that are influencing the decisions that they're making and their decision to be here in Victoria and in Australia more broadly.
Thanks, Melinda. Just a starting point for businesses who see a lot of this uncertainty. Businesses won't be seeing uncertainty when it comes to the shifts in consumer preferences, how shareholders are moving and how investors are moving. So the change is inevitable. And so for businesses, they really need to take a strategic view of this, think about the pivot and the transformation that's required, and work out the least cost, most effective pathway to decarbonise, because it is going to happen. And we heard the context for that from Ross. Just in terms of policy, one idea floated last year was we have the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. We all know one of the key drivers for economic change is the flow of finance. We ought to think creatively about the Clean Energy Finance Corporation becoming the green bank for Australia. And I think that could spur a lot of investment, send a lot of signals into the marketplace, and something they're effectively acting as now, but you could actually change their mandate quite easily and be quite innovative in driving finance to drive decarbonisation.
Thanks, Pradeep. Casper, there's quite a few questions that kind of relate to what I was just asking you as well, including sort of reflecting on the sorts of incentives that have been crucial in the EU to driving investment. So perhaps you might just give us some insights, someone who's actually doing this stuff on the ground, what's really mattered from an incentives and policy and regulatory perspective.
Thank you, Melinda. So over the years, we have a very good interaction with both the federal and the state government, which have been supportive of us. We had the fortune of meeting with Lily Ambrosia, our Minister Lily Ambrosia, and she has also been speaking positively about pursuing offshore wind as a whole. In 2019, the federal government awarded us an exploration license to explore the potential of offshore wind and conduct the development work we're doing right now. And late last year, the federal government also allocated sufficient budget to finalize the Act for Offshore Clean Energy. And this here in the state of Victoria, the last year announced a budget allocation of 108 million to explore new energy innovative projects. And among others, that includes the offshore sector strategy work I mentioned before, but it also includes a fund where you can apply for development money to progress offshore wind and other technologies of that nature. So we do see a strong encouragement for us to develop our project here in Victoria and in Australia. And as we are owned by a fund management company called Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, who are responsible of investing super fund money, including also Australian super fund money in here. And we see a large interest from super funds to transition their investment into to renewable technologies, and especially also for Australia. So the strong support that each state and territory have made to a zero emission is positively affecting us and our wish to invest into the project and continuing that route.
Thanks, Casper. Another question for you, and then it's going to segue to Ross, which is, are you thinking, Casper, about onshore storage to complement the generation piece? And then the sort of broader question is really about the role of batteries. But first to you, Casper, the question around, is onshore storage something that's on the horizon for you?
It is something we find quite interesting. It's the route to zero emission requires a mix of technologies to deploy. Currently in our project and how we propose it, we do not ourselves develop a storage solution. but we have expressed an interest to discuss with people and see how our offshore wind park will benefit the system in that way. Among others, you can see Energy Australia going out announcing their batteries being built as Yulon exit. We believe, and we have done some modeling, that we to a large degree will be able to go in and cover that what's left when Yulon is not here. And of course, together with a battery that is even more enforced and strengthened. So that is an interesting area we have. Generally, the term of power to X, that is where you go really for the zero emission. It's not only the electricity system, it's when you use power to generate all the other energy you need to power your society. And also in our local area, hydrogen. And there we involve ourselves into the hydrogen discussion of Gippsland and Victoria to play our part.
Thanks, Casper. Ross and Pradeep, I guess, the question about batteries comes up a lot. How important is this, developing that capacity and sector, I guess, in how we manage our own transition?
We should see that, Melinda, as part of the general approach to firming renewable energy. The electrons produced by renewable energy, wind and solar, wind onshore and offshore, are very much cheaper these days in the areas with good resources than the old energy, but they need to be balanced by mechanisms that allow you to keep power flowing when it's needed and the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. Diversification of the renewable energy resource base helps a lot, and Casper's already mentioned that. If you add a different uncorrelated set of renewable resources, that reduces your need for storage, and so having a big new hunk of generation from wind in Bass Strait that's not correlated with the onshore wind, which has got a higher capacity factor, so it's available a higher percentage of the time than onshore wind, will help. And strengthening high voltage transmission across different parts of Australia, diversifying renewable energy resource reduces the need for storage. And then we've got to look at all the technologies. We've got a lot of opportunities for pumped hydro storage. The ARENA Fund work from the ANU showed the dimensions of it. Battery storage is coming down rapidly in cost, and we can now do it at a very large scale. Batteries especially suitable when you need lithium-ion battery, when you need rapidly huge surge of power input, or to absorb a surge of power input, are very good for stabilizing the grid, but costs of that are falling rapidly, an important part of the picture. Other battery technologies, other storage technologies will be more suitable where you've got to store for multiple hours, and there's a lot of exciting work going on in Australia for that. Vanadium-based flow batteries, various heat storage techniques, including in graphite, in silicon oxide. It's good to have a really competitive market where all of these things are testing themselves, and we'll end up with quite a mixture of storage technologies, and costs are coming down very rapidly. There's also a huge potential for demand management, for designing big industrial plants using energy so that they can vary the amount of power that they use at relatively low cost. Big opportunities for this in aluminium, huge opportunities in hydrogen production. You can turn off an electrolyzer, of course, by reducing capacity, capital utilization, but not by affecting performance in other ways. So it'll be a mixture of all of these things, and get the mix right, and the costs of firming intermittent renewables will be modest. The total cost of power will be much lower than new coal-based or gas-based plants, and batteries is a big part of that story, but only part of a big story.
Thanks, Ross. Pradeep, I think Ross has given us a pretty comprehensive answer there. So let me give you a different question if I can. This question is from Andrew Campbell at Vizian, and it's really around the energy transition, the pace of transition, and how fast we think that's going to happen, and in particular, how much pressure are businesses feeling now from an ESG perspective? We've seen business here, I think, ahead of government because of the pressure from investors, quite frankly. Are you seeing that as something that's going to continue to drive a pace of change amongst, at the business level that's perhaps faster than government, and how are you seeing that?
Forecasting is a mug's game, but the thing I can say is the pace of transformation will be faster than what we think. It is accelerating, admittedly off a low base, for example, around businesses and their ESG understanding. But nevertheless, the speed is quite extraordinary, and it's coming from multiple sources. It's being driven by consumers, it's being driven by investors, it's being driven by groups from offshore, it's being driven by the complexities of geopolitics. And this means we've got to be well prepared. And one of the things that links this with the previous kind of question is that we're seeing the speed of technological change around energy generation and the change in the mix there, but also on that storage front. And this is going to radically change the market as we know it. And I think there's an area of policy that we've got to really get right, which is the new network design and what this means for reliability and security and pricing for consumers and businesses will become really important. And I don't see us doing enough on that front to keep up with the speed of change that's going on.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to apologise to our viewers now, because what I'm going to attempt to do, and those of you who've been putting questions in, I'm going to attempt to cobble together a couple of questions that have come through and see if I can get our panellists to kind of cut across a few issues that are coming up. And it basically goes something like this. It's kind of like, how do we influence change so that we get the pace of change to pick up, particularly on the policy front? And the issues that people are raising are, who needs to lead this conversation? Is it community attitudes? Is it, behaviours? Is it regulators? Is it business? So who are we looking to drive this conversation? And sitting within that are two sort of points, if I can put it that way. One is someone referencing the fact that you'll get a lot of people saying that climate change is an important issue, but it's not the number one issue for them. So the number that's being put as the ANU study that shows climate change was the most important issue for 52% of voters, but only the most important issue for 13%. So how do we get that political traction if that's the landscape? And then sitting beneath that, Pradeep, someone's wanting to ask you about the influence of the fossil fuel lobby and how prevalent that is, and is that too big a voice? So I'm going to maybe ask for some insights from you and Ross on that. And then Casper, I'm going to maybe come back to you and just get some insights from you about the way you're engaging with a diverse group of stakeholders with your project and the sort of feedback you're getting there. So maybe if I start with you, Pradeep, then go Ross, and then finish with Casper, if that's okay. Sorry for being so directive, but...
Let me start with that last point first. The polarisation, the depiction of polarisation is unhelpful, around fossil fuel lobby, etc. We are in our democratic system, we all have people who put forward different views. But, the companies that are moving really quickly in this space are the fossil fuel companies. They are changing their strategic outlook, they're embarking on the investment. So, I'm really positive and hopeful about some of the changes that we're seeing there. But if we go back to this, you're right. The part of the reason why it hasn't been the biggest issue, because we haven't connected the debate of climate and growth and jobs. We've actually had a debate that says taking action on climate change is bad for jobs. And we've had well over a decade of this, and that's got to stop. And I think it's starting to stop. You're seeing state governments realising the politics of this. We're seeing this play through because this is an intergenerational issue. We're starting to see the influence of younger people about their future starting to play through in terms of the politics. So one is we've got to change the narrative to one of being positive about the benefits. The second, we will see the intergenerational kind of issues play through. And the third is we have some lessons. Look at what we just did last year, right? National government was able to bring some focus. Globally, we were able to bring some focus to this issue of the vaccine, and public and private work together. And look what a game changer the vaccines are likely to be. Right? So it is a question about coordination and will. And I think if we paint the picture of that, then we will find regulators and policymakers moving quickly. But it doesn't require us to outsource it to the public sector. As individuals, as corporations, we can take action because our workforce is telling us that, our customers are telling us that, our shareholders are telling us that.
Thanks, Pradeep. Ross, you've been, as I've said before, in and around this conversation for a long time. How are you seeing, the sort of influences and perspectives on, how we really start to push momentum faster on these critical areas of transition?
Yeah, I think there has been a bit of a political failure. You can have government failure just like you can have market failure. And I think community attitudes on the whole, they're mixed, of course, and differentiated, but on the whole, they've been supportive of quite strong action way back to 2007, 2008, more supportive now than ever before. But the micro detail of the way our political system works has got in the way of strong action from time to time. We're different from other countries in that other countries have all got themselves to zero net emissions by 2050. Democracies can fail for a while, but they don't keep failing. One of the advantages of democracy is that you can change, get rid of leaders who don't change their mind with the community. I think it's essential that what I call the independent centre of our polity, which CEDA is a very important part of, people without particular vested interests in particular sectors, without partisan political interests. I keep pushing the discussion of what's in the public interest. I think there is a base in community attitudes in support of strong action, vigorous discussion, intelligent discussion led by CEDA and other parts of the independent centre of the polity makes it hard for politicians to deny the economic realities. It makes it easier for them to be innovative in forcing change. I think that's the critical thing. And I don't underestimate the importance of the international political developments in this. They're very large. The shift in the US from a climate-denying president who was trying to stop world action on climate change to one who's committed to zero emissions electricity by 2035 in the US, zero emissions in the economy as a whole by 2050, and determined to make sure that the rest of the world shifts too. Well, the US doesn't always get its way on everything, but it's influential. So adding that to the strong base of community support, the business framework, I think that if people who think about policy can define the public interest in policy are active, I think the opportunity is there to move things forward at this time. Thanks,
Ross. Casper, really interested, we've got a couple of minutes to go just in terms of, what are the issues that you're hearing about when you're talking to people on the ground around your project, the opportunities and risks and concerns about it specifically, but also just, climate change more broadly?
Generally, we see a very strong commitment to our project in our community. So we have been out, of course, asking questions and also done surveys. And we see that more than 80% of people in the region support creating jobs within renewable technologies and also deem that is necessary for the future. And I think it falls equally on the shoulders of industry and politicians and other stakeholders. But for us as an industry, it's important to show there is a future. There is a transition into something that where people have a role to play, and that falls on our shoulders. That's why we very actively go out and tell the story of offshore wind and the benefit that comes with it, and the transition of people into new job opportunities. From a political side, of course, it helps. We also we own the first project in the US as well. And we are very encouraged by Joe Biden coming now out and pushing for offshore wind, which enables our project to move faster ahead and be the first large-scale project in US. But we also see strong commitment for state government here and the federal government of developing the framework we need. So right now, we as a proponent and a developer, we have the tools we need to progress. But of course, in the future, we need more guidance on how to actually fit in an offshore wind farm into the system on all levels of government and regulatory matters.
Yeah, thank you for that. And what a great way to finish. I, of course, have the privilege of having the last word. And let me finish where we started, I think, with the focus on the can-do. You know, energy is a critical driver of economic development in Australia and everywhere. It's been a great source of advantage to us for decades. And I think, you know, just taking the words out of Ross Garner's mouth, that we can be that leader in energy in the future based on the tremendous benefits that we have and advantages that we have with renewable energy. And so I really hope that this is the beginning of many conversations for us under the CEDA banner, if you like, around how we can actually turn this into a source of real advantage, investment opportunity, the opportunities to spark economic dynamism and jobs in Australia. So thank you all for being part of this conversation today. If you're interested in more of our events, please get to our website, ceda.com.au. We've got a real pipeline of events building up now, so sort of back in the game, if I can put it that way. So please have a look at the website. And let me thank our panellists again, Ross Garno, Casper Torhog and Pradeep Phillip. Ross, I'm sorry, I have to say one more thing. There is a whole conversation I'd love to have on China, so expect another invitation in your inbox around China, climate, energy and everything else. I'm sorry we couldn't get to that today. Thank you again for being part of this, and I look forward to seeing some of you face-to-face in the future. Good afternoon.